Morning. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 Interconnection Process Enhancements Phase 2 Initiative meeting to discuss the revised straw proposal, which was posted on June 7th. My name is Elisandra Casillas, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. I'm also joined by Steve Ruddy, Director of Grid Assets, along with others from the Interconnection Resources Group. This presentation and other materials related can be found on the initiative webpage. Next slide, please. Some housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded and the video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. The meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. Please keep comments professional and respectful. And in the interest of time, please try and be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so we can manage the time efficiently. Next slide, please. Instructions for questions. We will pause for questions periodically throughout the meeting. You can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx, or if you've joined via audio only, please press pound 2 on your device. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making your comment. If you need technical assistance during today's meeting, please feel free to send a chat to the event producer. You may also send your questions via chat to all panelists. Next slide, please. After I'm finished with my welcome and introduction, I will go ahead and turn the meeting over to Steve, who will discuss the background, Phase 2 process enhancements, other residual issues, and we'll close with the next steps. Next slide, please. This graphic depicts the ISO stakeholder process. We are currently in the straw proposal development phase of the stakeholder process, and I'll review the next steps in the process at the end of this presentation. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And from here, I will turn the meeting over to Steve Ruddy.
All right, thank you, Ellie, and thank you everyone for participating today. So in our ongoing commitment to improve the generation interconnection process as resource interconnection needs evolve, the ISO periodically runs interconnection process enhancements, or IPE as we call it. These stakeholder initiatives are run every couple of years. And the current 2021 IPE initiative, which was launched last September, was divided into 2 distinct phases. Phase 1 addressed topics focused on near-term enhancements that can be applied to Cluster 14, as well as topics that could be addressed more quickly. These Phase 1 topics were approved by the ISO board on May 12th and submitted to FERC on June 2nd. Now, this current Phase 2 of IPE focuses on resolving longer-term modifications that can be applied to future clusters, as well as residual issues related to the Phase 1 enhancements that were not fully resolved in the Phase 1 process. The issues being addressed fall into one of 3 categories: topics that would aid in moving resources more efficiently and effectively through the queue, topics that would aid in managing the overheated interconnection queue, and topics addressing other residual issues warranting attention at this time. The ISO is targeting the ISO Board of Governors October 2022 meeting for approval of these Phase 2 initiatives. So I'm going to keep the introduction here very brief, and that was it, so that we have plenty of time to discuss the various issues for Phase 2. So why don't we move on to the next slide? And one more. Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn the meeting over now to Jeff Billington, who is going to cover the first 2 items, number 3.1 and 3.2.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks. As indicated, it's Jeff Billington here. So item 3.1, with respect to better aligning the transmission capabilities and policy objectives of the new generation portfolios developed in the planning for planning purposes. The ISO, we've concluded that this topic, based upon discussion and feedback that we've had, would be more appropriate to be considered in the context of the ISO transmission planning process, where policy-driven transmission are coordinated with state input. With respect to this, we'll be seeking further stakeholder input on this issue in a separate stakeholder process, and we're looking at initiating this process in the first or second week of July, and with the associated transmission planning process enhancements. So that's with regards to the coordination and how we're looking to proceed with this. If you go to the next slide. And in regards to 3.2, that was related to solicitation, and should a solicitation model be considered for some key locations and constraints not addressed in direct portfolio development. The ISO is not seeking to advance this proposal at this time, but we will also be seeking input on this issue in a separate stakeholder process. This is the one that we identified in the 2021-2022 transmission plan, and in specific looking at expression of interest in the Idaho wind area, and we'll be holding a separate process for this, seeking input on the process, and then as we go forward to gauge the interest of procurement in those areas. And for this stakeholder initiative, we're looking to kick that off in the last week in June. So Steve, that provides that. I guess we could see if there's any questions, but on those two topics.
Sounds good, Jeff. Chris, can we check for questions?
And as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, you can do so by clicking on the raise hand icon on WebEx, or if you're down to the phone line, please press #2. And at this time, I do see couple questions in queue. Okay, Fernando, please go ahead.
Good morning, and thanks again for hosting this stakeholder meeting. Appreciate the input so far, Jeff and Steve. Just regarding process-wise, it wasn't clear to me that are these first two topics going to be folded into a soon-to-be-launched transmission enhancements initiative, or are these going to be two different paths that are going to be used to address these first two topics that we just discussed?
They'll be two separate. We'll be initiating in one stakeholder process some transmission planning process enhancements. And in the second, it's a follow-up from the 2021-2022 transmission plan, where we identified that we'd be launching this initiative with regards to the kind of Open Season Act process to assess the interest level and competition that exists in the Idaho wind resources.
So the potential for integrating to a greater degree the interconnection activities along with the procurement and transmission, that's going to be part of some soon-to-be launched transmission enhancements initiative that will presumably cover more topics beyond the one that we just discussed, the 3.1. 3.2, is this going to be a standalone topic to be addressed in a separate form?
Yeah, 3.2 will be on a separate, like I say, it's a continuation of the 2021-2022 transmission planning process. The other one will be a broader for the transmission planning and looking at aligning kind of the planning and resource portfolio and how we plan the transmission that's in the portfolios related to kind of access to that transmission. So more will come on that when we initiate that process, like I say, and that's targeted for the first or second week in July.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate the clarification.
Moving on to our next caller. And Arash, your line is now unmuted.
Great. Good morning, Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, this is Arash Watsion with EDF Renewables. So on 3.2, just trying to better understand the question. So is this more of a policy planning tied to this question, or is it interconnection related?
Well, I think it's a bit of both as we look at it.
Okay, and is that how the ISO determined that it's outside the scope of process improvement?
I think it was a combination of, as well as feedback that we'd received as well.
Yeah, Jeff, this is Steve. You know, we put out this question in September of last year, and while there was interest in pursuing something, there was never a solid proposal that came out of it. And so within the initiative, we really don't have anything to take forward at this time. So we thought it'd be best to remove it kind of from IPE for now and see how it develops and see if a model can develop through the transmission plan of the, you know, looking at the Idaho area or other areas that might be a good, you know, candidate for a solicitation model. So that's kind of how we've decided to approach this now. There was just nothing that came from stakeholders or internally at this time to push forward in IPE.
Sure, and I appreciate that. And I guess, flipping back through history, I think that the focus back then was more of what kind of process improvements with the existing process folks can provide feedback on. So it might be worth for consideration to reopen these two topics and seek feedback. But that's just a suggestion. I mean, there just seems like obviously there's a need for transmission and looking at some of these questions if there's an opportunity for stakeholders to be engaged and provide fresh feedback on the two questions, it might be worth considering. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. And if you do have some solid proposals that we could, you know, turn into a proposal in the next paper, please add them to your comments. Again, we went through I think 3 or 4 rounds of this, and again, the response was, yeah, this sounds great, but we have no idea what to do. So
I think, sure, no, I appreciate that. I think everybody has proposals. We all have ideas, right? But given the stakeholder process, there needs to be, I guess, an engagement through that for ideas to be shared and discussed, and ultimately, collectively, we can all draw a conclusion. I don't think we can form a solid idea within 3 to 4 months and call it good and move it forward. But thank you.
Yeah, we're definitely not closing the door on this. If you have something that you'd like to propose, you know, might want to put it in your general comments at the beginning of the comment matrix, or, you know, definitely participate in this 2021-2022 transmission plan. I guess they're calling it a continuation of that effort.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
There are no more questions.
All right, thanks, Chris. Why don't we go to the next slide? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie Levine.
All right, thanks, Steve. Hold on 2 seconds. There we go. Okay. Oop, now I'm frozen. All right, let me go ahead and get started, and hopefully I'll become unfrozen. Let me see. So part of what in phase 1, we went ahead and took the data transparency issue that was originally brought forth by Gridwell and put that into a separate initiative, which we've been working on, and we've already had 2 papers out on that and a meeting for discussion. And part of the discussion that we had over in the data transparency item was that a number of the data items that are being requested by stakeholders are actually items that are considered confidential by the ISO. So what we agreed to over in the data transparency initiative was to go ahead and bring to this group, because this is how we'll go ahead and amend the tariff to the extent that we need to do it, the data items that will become public as part of the data that is being requested by various participants. So first, I wanted to go ahead and just bring everybody up to speed with the definitions that we currently have in the tariff for confidential. All right, so there's two sections that are applicable. Section 22 is the tariff section that has what confidential information is. And confidential information there has been actually boiled down to only critical infrastructure information. All right, so location of a power plant, line, those types of things, that's considered critical information. There's, NERC has a definition for critical information. And then in the GitApp, Appendix DD, Section 15.1, there's a separate definition of critical information when it comes to the generator interconnection process. And in that one, it is information related to technology, research and development, business affairs, and pricing. And then that section goes on to say that to the extent that one of those items was originally confidential but becomes public, then it's considered public in the future as far as the availability for that data. So that's the foundation as to what we currently have in the tariff for what is confidential and how we've been treating the data to date. So somebody else has comments. Next slide, please, Chris. So the information that meets, from our perspective, the definition of confidential is PPA status is considered confidential due to pricing information and market sensitivity, but not necessarily that the project has a PPA or the megawatts of the PPA. So those are potentially items that could become public, but the overall status and what's included in the PPA is considered confidential. Projects formerly known as names are confidential because that's business affairs and a legal issue. And then site exclusivity, documentation, and status are considered confidential due to pricing and commercial sensitivity. So those are the three items the CAISO believes are considered confidential, consistent with the two references I gave in the tariff. Next slide, please, Chris. So the items that could be made public, which we haven't done before, but could be made public, consist of this entire list. So percentage of partial capacity deliverability status, whether the project has interim deliverability status, information on the project at a phase level, what are the megawatts, what for each resource ID. Resource IDs are public, you'll see on the next slide. We're going to be putting out as soon as we can get the report services set up. But we'll be adding a new report that goes ahead and gives you a key, in essence, between project queue number and then resource IDs. So the question becomes is, okay, you have the resource ID, you know the total megawatts now of the project, you know the two gen fuel types for the project. What about, what are the milestone dates? Is it a hybrid or co-located? For battery storage units, people are interested in the megawatt hour data. We don't currently have that data. That's data that's supposed to be coming with phase 2B of the hybrid initiative, but won't be online until later this year, potentially next year, depending upon where that data element ends up falling. And then what transmission planning, deliverability group, and allocation did the project get on the phase basis? What's the suspension status of the project? Is the project in suspension? And that's why the timing of the project has been, in essence, stopped, because they won't go ahead and change their COD date until they come out of suspension. As I said earlier, has the PPA been executed and how many megawatts have been executed? What's the construction status? What's the project parking status? What's the project effective system status? So those are the items that are, in essence, open for discussion as to whether we should make that information public. Is it something that people voluntarily want to go ahead and allow the ISO to include in a report that we put out? That might be a little bit harder for us if we have some people volunteering but not other people, because we'd have to figure out how to only take the information for some of the projects. But just wanted to get feedback on people's thoughts about making, and especially the interconnection customers, because it's your data, about making this data public. Anyone have any thoughts at this point?
At this time, we don't have any individuals in the queue or any comments in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. All right, next slide, please. So, did we go 2 slides? Can you back up a slide? Oh, okay. Used to be another slide there. Don't know what happened to it. Yeah, it's okay. No, you're fine. Going to the next slide, slide 13 is fine. So, we're seeking further feedback on specific data items that interconnection customers are okay with making the information public. Once it's determined what data is going to be made public, then we're going to have to determine if a tariff amendment is required. If people are more comfortable that there's a tariff requirement that requires them to produce the data, or we could put it in the BPM that data has to be done, and then provided publicly, and then determine the timing and formatting of publishing the data agreed to in a report service, as I had said earlier. So we are looking for this forum to have that discussion, not the data transparency forum. So I'd really be interested if anybody has any thoughts about whether the data that's being requested should be made public, should not be made public. We are going to go ahead and, as I said earlier, we will be producing a report since the resource IDs are public. Then we'll go ahead and, based on the public data, that was the item in the Appendix DD confidentiality. If the information does become public, then it's considered public. So since the project name and queue number are public and the resource ID is public, then we'll go ahead and we'll produce a report that includes that data. And we're looking right now at how to put that together and the report services that we'd have to develop in order to do that. Chris, I see a question from Sanju. Could you open her line, please?
Hi, David. This is Sanju from Great Bright representing Calvia. Just a clarifying question. On your list, the first item, percentage of PCDS and IDS, those are public once the generator is operational. They are on the public NQC list. So does that mean they are also, since they are public later on, they are public for queued generators?
No, they're not public until they actually go COD. So that's an item that is not public till it goes COD. So the resource IDs, in essence, would not be included in the queue listing until that resource ID becomes public.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
It looks like we do have one more caller in the phone line queue. And caller, your line is now unmuted.
Thank you. Good morning, Debbie. This is Rayanne Quadro with Gridwell Consulting on behalf of EDF Renewables.
Good morning.
I didn't want to take any time reiterating what I think should be public because, that's in our comments and it was also in my presentation last October. But I did want to make a note on timing. I think given the supercluster 14, as well as the potential changes coming forward to cluster 15 regarding interconnection customer limits on how expensive the deposits are based on how many interconnection requests are submitted, that getting as much data out there as possible would be really helpful. The more information that developers have to do their analysis and winnow down their number of interconnection requests, the better. So I think that that's sort of a mutually beneficial situation. So if that information could be published, say, before the end of this calendar year, to the extent that it's identified and approved in this initiative, I think that would be really helpful.
Okay. And Rayanne, if I can put you on the spot, so what is EDF making that data public? If we could back up a slide, Chris,
I'm sorry?
to 12.
I'm actually on the phone right now, Deb, so I can't see your slide. But EDF did put in specific comments discussing each of the items last round, and I'd be happy to forward you a link to those. Would that be okay?
I've got. Yep. No, I've already got those comments. Okay. All right.
Okay, great. Yeah, it was pretty detailed. So, but if you have individual questions, happy to talk about it.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, and at this time, I do not see any more questions in queue.
All right, then I think you can go on to slide 14. And I think we're in a new section, Steve, so I'll turn it back. Oh, 3.4.
Thanks, Deb. That's mine.
All right, so Bob, off to you.
So good morning, everybody. This is Bob Emmert, and this topic is revisiting the criteria for PPAs to be eligible for transmission plan deliverability allocations. The revised TPD allocation groups and criteria from phase 1 were approved by the ISO board and filed with FERC. However, the criteria for PPAs to be eligible for a TPD allocation were pulled from the proposal approved by the board due to stakeholder comments, and these are being reintroduced into the IPE phase 2. The ISO believes that further clarification of the eligibility criteria of a PPA are necessary to ensure system-supplied transmission capacity is allocated on a basis that prioritizes projects that are most ready to proceed and can demonstrate a clear and timely path for providing resource adequacy capacity. So the ISO is seeking additional stakeholder input on 2 issues related to a PPA's eligibility to receive an allocation. And these are, the first one is, should the allocation of TPD require that a PPA has procured the project's RA capacity for some minimum term, such as a number of years? And if yes, what should that minimum term be? And the second item is, should a PPA that is with an entity that does not have an RA obligation be eligible to receive an allocation if the procuring entity demonstrates that it has a contract to sell the RA capacity procured to a load-serving entity that has an RA obligation? And if yes, should the procuring entity be given extra time after the project receives an allocation to secure that contract with a load-serving entity with an RA obligation? And if the answer to that is yes, what length of extra time should be provided? So at this time, the ISO has not put forth a specific proposal in the paper, and we seek stakeholder comments on these questions. We will use those comments received to develop proposals on these issues in the next paper. And we ask that comments be as specific as possible, provide why the stakeholders believe as they do, and provide any basis for any terms or timeframes suggested. So are there any questions on this process?
And as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, you can do so by clicking on the raise hand icon on WebEx or press #2 if you're dialed into the phone line. And at this time, I do not see any questions.
All right, next slide then. And I believe Steve is taking this one.
Yes, thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. All right. So in the September preliminary issue paper, the ISO sought stakeholder input on whether the bar for entry into interconnection process should be raised to discourage numerous and perhaps excessive interconnection request submissions by a single developer, such as requiring higher deposits for submitting an interconnection request or imposing other requirements. Stakeholders were generally supportive for higher fees and imposing other requirements. In the December 6th issue paper and straw proposal, the ISO proposed that for the first 2 interconnection requests submitted by a parent company in a cluster window, the study deposit would be $250,000 per request. For interconnection requests 3 through 5, the study deposit would be $500,000 per request, and for any more than 5 interconnection requests, the study deposit would be $1 million per request. Well, stakeholder feedback on that proposal was mixed. Some fully supported it. Some suggested alternative deposit tier amounts, and some opposed, stating that the higher fees could be a barrier for small developers, or that the ISO did not provide evidence that multiple requests submitted by a single party were less serious or less chance to be successful than those parties that submitted fewer requests. So in the latest straw proposal that we posted, the ISO again showed a table with a breakdown of the 373 requests that we received in cluster 14 that demonstrated a large percentage of the interconnection requests come from a minority of parent companies. There were 10 parent companies that submitted more than 11 projects each, with 3 of them submitting more than 20. As you all know, to accommodate this large cluster, the ISO had to file with FERC to extend the study timelines for cluster 14 by approximately a year to accommodate the increase in the study burden associated with meeting the study requirements. Stakeholders made it clear that a repeat of cluster 14 is not acceptable. This level of competition actually creates distractions and commandeers precious planning, engineering, and project management resources from ISO and participating TOs. Also included in the latest straw proposal is a table representing clusters 10 through 13 that shows when parent companies submit more than 2 interconnection requests, those projects withdraw at a much higher percentage rate than parent companies that only submit 1 or 2 interconnection requests. So this tends to validate the concern that some developers submit numerous interconnection requests to use the ISO study process to explore even remotely plausible projects. In addition to burdening staff resources at the ISO and the participating transmission owners, this also means the initial phase 1 study results are based on much less reasonable volumes and study assumptions than would otherwise be the case. So the ISO continues to believe that increasing fees with more at risk earlier in the process will be an effective tool to discourage excessive interconnection requests. The ISO also believes the tier deposit approach is appropriate, so we do not disadvantage small developers. And also to ease the administrative challenges, the ISO believes each interconnection request from the same parent company should have the same deposit required. So that's a change from our original proposal. So that's kind of some background on that. The ISO proposes to increase the study deposits with more at risk earlier in the process, going back to the slide here, to encourage developers to submit a reasonable number of IRs for high quality resources, and to disincentivize submittal of this disproportionate amount of IRs that overwhelm resources and slow the study process. The proposal includes a tiered deposit approach so as to not disadvantage small developers that submit 1 or 2 IRs and do not contribute to the problem. And each IR from the same parent company will have the same study deposit required. If we go to the next slide, please, Chris. So here's our current proposal. And remember, this is a straw proposal, welcoming comments. We're looking at making the first, if a parent company submits 1 or 2 projects, they'll be at $250,000 each. If they submit 3 to 4, they will be at $375,000 each. So 1 through 4 will all be $375,000. And then 5 to 7, so 1 through 7 would be at $500,000. And so forth. 8 to 10, or 1 through 10 would be $650,000, and 1 through any more than 11 would be $800,000 each. The reason why we went to this approach is that if a parent company puts in 4 or 5 projects, they won't be concerned about which one, if they need to withdraw one, which one would be their $250,000 project with the earlier proposal, and which one might be their $1 million project. So every project from a parent company will have the same deposit amount. All right, next slide, please, Chris. So as I also mentioned, we're looking at making, changing the refund criteria so that there's more at risk earlier in the process. So if an interconnection request is withdrawn for any reason, the study deposit is refundable minus costs until the interconnection request is determined complete. So you put in an application, and we go through all of our steps to deem you complete, making sure all of your technical information is there, the documentation for site exclusivity and things like that, as well as confirming the deposit has been made. Once we determine that you are complete, 20% will become non-refundable. And the 20% non-refundable will last from when it's determined complete up until 30 days following the scoping meeting. 30 days following the scoping meeting, 50% of your deposit becomes non-refundable. That is if you withdraw. And that lasts up until 30 days following your phase 1 study results meeting. After the phase 1 study results meetings, 100% becomes non-refundable. Again, once you reach commercial operation, anything we do not need or have not spent on your behalf will be refunded. So these non-refundabilities are only due to if you withdraw after being determined complete up until when you go commercial. Okay, so with that, why don't we open it up to some questions?
Once again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by clicking on the raise hand icon on WebEx or pressing #2 if you're dialed into the phone line. So moving on to our first caller. And Bridget, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Bridget Sparks with AES Clean Energy. So first off, we want to thank the CAISO for putting out data to support their proposal on the number of projects submitted by the same parent company leading to different dropout rates. But I was wondering if you all conducted any sort of statistical analysis to determine if the differences between those two groups were actually meaningful.
Well, I guess I'm not following your question. It seems pretty apparent that those that put in more interconnection requests are withdrawing and pulling them out of the study process at a higher rate than those that do not. It seems pretty meaningful,
right.
meaningful to me.
Yeah, so I actually did conduct difference of proportions tests. So you can actually do, with the table you provided, you can actually do a Z test to determine if those differences are statistically significant or whether or not it's just due to random chance or some other variation in the data and not actually meaningful difference between the number of projects submitted. And so for clusters 10 and 11, those differences are statistically significant at a 95% confidence level, but for clusters 13 and 14, they're not statistically significant at the 95% confidence level, and cluster 14 is really not significant at all. And so to me, this kind of shows that the more recent clusters that have had a higher number of applications maybe due more to the growing demand for new projects with the CPUC's procurement allocation and us trying to catch up on midterm reliability rather than indicative of speculative projects. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, that even though there appears to be differences, if you actually do simple statistical analysis, it actually shows that for clusters 10 and 11, those differences are significant, but not for the more recent clusters. So one thought I had, or another question I have in light of those results are, could you look at this data and break it out by who has site control versus those that did deposit and move site control? And I wonder if you'd also see a greater difference. So if you submit a lot of projects, but you have site control, you're more likely to move forward versus if you don't have site control, submit a lot of projects. It seems to me like that would also be help explaining these differences. And so that's maybe one thing suggestion to look at. And since the CAISO did change their site exclusivity results, I also wonder if in the next, cluster 15, if we'll also see sort of a natural decline in the number of projects submitted because the barrier to entry is higher. And so I would suggest looking at site exclusivity data if you have that available. And then I also wonder, the CAISO site exclusivity requirements are also lower than what the other markets are. So for MISO and PJM, site exclusivity is 100% of site control, but under the CAISO tariff definition, it's only 50% of the land. So rather than, just putting more money on larger developers, maybe having greater land that has to be controlled to move forward might be a more effective tool to cool off the queue. And then another thing, it seems like the proposal does a good job of not discriminating against smaller developers, but I do think now it's kind of tipped the scales to being discriminatory towards larger developers. And I think we have seen sort of a concentration in the industry of kind of developers buying up smaller developers, and so you might see a greater concentration in firms that might also be kind of explaining the results where, in the past, there were, 10 or 12 smaller developers that have since been bought up by 3 or 4. So parent companies look like they're submitting more projects, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're any less legitimate. So while AES Clean Energy doesn't object to higher deposits, and we do think it is an effective tool, we do object to tying it to the number of projects submitted. And we think a more effective policy might be to do sort of a base application fee. So you could keep it at that $250 and then do an additional fee that's based on the size of the project. So MISO scales their study deposits by the size of the project. PJM also has the readiness deposits determined by $4,000 per megawatt. And so we think something like that that's based on the size of the project rather than the number of projects submitted by the parent company would be a way to also deter people from submitting more projects that are necessary to do this sort of POI shopping by making it more expensive, but also not discriminating against legitimate projects that do have site control just because they happen to come from a larger developer. So just want to kind of put that feedback out there, especially in light of the fact that for clusters 13 and 14, those differences in that chart aren't actually statistically significant. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and I hope to see that in your comments. A comment on cluster 14. I didn't include that in the table because
sorry, 13 sorry, 12 and 13. Sorry.
Okay. 12 and 13 still have a number of milestones they need to reach where there's going to be another tranche that will be withdrawing, I'm sure, when their deposits are required and when their parking opportunities are completed. And so, yeah, there are some other issues that will be coming up there. So some of those do not have the financial security at risk yet. And so I imagine we're going to see a number of those dropping out as they need to make those deposits, which are quite a bit. But our goal now is to, we have the transparency issue going on. Transparency effort going on to try to provide more data and information for projects so they can make very educated applications. But we cannot have 370 projects come in again and then delay it another year for cluster 15. That's just not going to be acceptable. So we have to put more at risk earlier, and the cost has got to go up. And so, the cost of getting in. So, that's my initial thoughts on your comments. But yeah, I agree that there are some statistics of 12 and 13 that are not yet in play that could be really illustrated in that. But even without that, there was still a much higher withdrawal rate for those that put in multiple projects versus those that put one or two in. All right, thank you. Any other questions?
We can now go to our next one in queue. Arash, your line is now unmuted.
Great, thank you. This is Arash Awatian with ADF Renewables. I guess I want to first thank CAISO for bringing out this initial proposal. I think this is a good start. Kind of going back to some of Bridget's comments, I do agree with her on the other models that have been functional over the last 5 to 6 years. If you look between, MISO and last year SPP and this year PJM, they're all trending towards that direction. Unfortunately, you're always going to run into this situation of discriminatory, whether it's a small developer or large developer, but we've seen that something needs to get done. Even with the rules today in place, MISO this year had about 70 gigawatt added to their queue, even after rounds and rounds of process improvement. So kudos to you guys for moving towards that direction. I do think that you're going to need kind of this proposal plus the site control criteria that you guys have proposed in order to reduce the number of projects getting into the queue. I know folks probably don't like to hear about speculative projects, but there are speculative projects out there as you've kind of talked through this. So again, we've brought this up early on in IPE1, phase 1, about potential models similar to what you've seen in MISO and SPP and now PJM. I think it's working in combination of other changes. So we'll be providing that in our feedback to you folks and hope to have further discussions on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Look forward to your comments.
All right, and at this time, there are no more callers in queue.
Okay. Why don't we go to the next one? All right, this is also me. This is on the alternative cost allocation treatment for network upgrades to local systems where the associated generation benefits more than or other than the customers within the service area. The ISO tariff requires participating TOs to reimburse interconnection customers whose generators are interconnecting to their systems for the cost of reliability and local delivery network upgrades necessary for the interconnection. The participating transmission owners then include those network upgrade reimbursement costs in their FERC-approved transmission rate base requiring ratepayers to pay those costs either through their local regional transmission access charge or their regional. Network upgrades for 200 kV and above are considered regional, and upgrades below 200 are considered local. You know, again, the regional transmission access charge is spread across the entire ISO, and in contrast, the local transmission access charge is PTO specific, charged only to customers within that service area, the PTO owning the facilities. There is ongoing concern that the current practice for local upgrades could unduly impact local ratepayers who are not the sole beneficiaries of the upgrades, but who solely bear the cost. As you recall, the ISO attempted this to address this issue a couple years back in 2017. We had a very narrowly focused proposal to FERC, and they ultimately found that the ISO failed to support its proposal as just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory, but only rejected it without prejudice. So we can continue to revisit this issue and even the original proposal. But this proposal in December, the ISO proposed that the addition of capital costs for low voltage network upgrades driven by generation interconnections to the local transmission revenue requirement, or LTRR, of a PTO will not cause the aggregate of the net investment for all low voltage network upgrades driven by the generation interconnection included in the LTRR to exceed 15% of the aggregate of the net investment for all low voltage transmission facilities. And this is a lot of words of what our proposal was, but basically, if an entity has $100 million invested in their low voltage system, the amount that could be used for a generation interconnection would be capped at 15 million, or the 15% would be 15 million. So once that generator hit 15 million, once the PTO hit $15 million of refundable amounts to generators, at that point, our proposal was that any cost over that would be borne by the generator or by the developer. The ISO is not proposing to revise or change its proposal at this time, but we do want to seek and continue to flesh out details of this proposal before further refinements or a final proposal is made. So if we look at the slide again, the ISO is proposing to cap the percentage of interconnection-related network upgrades within each PTO's local transmission revenue requirement. We'll use a cost-limiting model similar to the funding for location-constrained resource interconnection, or LCRIF, facilities. Any cost for low voltage network upgrades greater than a 15% threshold will be financed by the interconnection customer without reimbursement. This does protect the local ratepayers from the impact of interconnection-related network upgrades that really do not benefit them. And the proposal would apply to all transmission owners equally, so that it's not non-discriminatory in that fashion. As you read through the paper, we try to address a number of comments about the straw proposal. I encourage you to read through those. It's too much to read here. But the ISO attempted to address those comments and concerns, but we are definitely welcoming further feedback. As you saw in the paper, there was a table in there that covered the current status of San Diego Gas and Electric, as well as Southern Cal Edison and VEA, and shows that this proposal really doesn't have much impact on San Diego or SCE, but VEA customers would be hit pretty quickly with one or two interconnection requests on their low voltage system. The data was not readily available from PG&E, so we're waiting on that. That could change our outlook. We'll have to see when we get their data. But that's kind of where we're at. We're not really suggesting at this point to change anything at this time. and we're sticking with our original proposal and would like to further flesh it out with stakeholders. Any questions on this one?
Again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by clicking on the raise hand icon on WebEx or pressing #2 on your phone if you're dialed into the phone line only. And at this time, I do not see any questions.
Oh, interesting. Well, thank you. But please submit your comments on this one. This is a very important one to the ISO and to our stakeholders, and so we'd like to hear any input you have to be able to give us. Thank you. Why don't we move on to the next slide, please? I'm going to now turn it over to Linda Wright.
Thanks, Steve. Good morning, everybody. Today, the slide's about the ISO is proposing 2 items relative to the ISO as an affected system. First item is how the base case will be determined for these studies. It's proposed to use a base case based on the previously queued projects as of the date of the affected system study agreement execution. Stakeholders' comments were received from the December 2021 issues and straw proposal supported this methodology, and so this proposal is unchanged. The second item is how any required network upgrades triggered by an affected system are to be paid for. The ISO proposes to use its existing policy to reimburse network upgrades triggered by affected systems. This includes reimbursement within 5 years. Network upgrades to the ISO system benefit the ratepayers, regardless of the location of the generator. Some have requested that the ISO seek reciprocity of reimbursement from neighboring systems. Neighboring utilities are not discriminating by not reimbursing for affected system upgrades. They're simply applying their own policy consistently, as they do not reimburse for network upgrades to projects within their systems. This is in line with what the ISO is proposing, applying its existing reimbursement policy to network upgrades, whether the upgrades are triggered by a project interconnecting to the ISO, or if it is triggered by a project interconnecting to a neighboring system. Are there any questions?
At this time, I do not see any questions in queue.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Why don't we move on to the next slide, please? I think we're back to Debbie.
Yep, you are. All right. So in the original IPE initiative, we had this question that was 5 different questions as to how the ISO could go ahead and move projects, within the queue, and to the extent that projects are not moving, should we have the ability to terminate the GIA earlier than the 7 years? So the first question evolved around, what do we do with energy only? At the moment, energy only projects can stay in the queue in essence forever. The second question was with respect to projects not replying to information that's been requested, or material modifications that are being requested. Should we invoke the default clause to get the project to actually either act or terminate the agreement? Next slide, please. Question number 3 was with MMAs. If they are not initiating the MMA to move the project into a achievable COD, should we use the default clause there? And then we do get quarterly reports from the projects. If the projects aren't moving as far as permitting, procurement, and construction, is that a reason to go ahead and get the project out of the queue? And then lastly, were there any other suggestions about moving stalled projects through the queue, so that we could, get a size of the queue that is actually something that is manageable versus what we have today? So next slide, please. So based on all the feedback that we received in the first portion of the Phase 1 initiative. What the ISO proposal is at this point is to go ahead and use, as someone suggested, Section 6.5.2.1 of the VPM for generator management, which in essence gives us a little bit more teeth than we have been invoking to go ahead and, if the project isn't moving through permitting and engineering, procurement, construction, getting them to meet those deadlines consistent with their tariff. Another proposal that came forward was if energy-only projects that have already been in the queue for 7 years and they contribute to short-circuit duty and they still aren't moving, then, you know, those projects should be terminated. And then lastly, invoking the breach clause if information is not supplied when requested, if milestone dates are not met, or if other terms and conditions of the GIA are not met. So based on all the feedback so far, this is what our proposal is. So we'd welcome any other thoughts as far as items, but we think that these items are sufficient at this point anyways to give us a leg up in trying to move some of the projects along that seemed to be stalled based on the information that we currently have. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Sanju? Chris, if you could open up Sanju's line.
Hi, this is Sanju from Bright. So on the short-circuit duty, we previously proposed to say critical short-circuit duty. I understand that you don't want that critical because it's too subjective, but if just say contribute to short-circuit duty, do you mean the contributing to short-circuit duty that would require some upgrades in system? Otherwise, no, every project contribute to short-circuit duty somewhere.
Right. Yeah. No, it would be if they contribute to upgrades, and upgrades they're not willing to pay for, which typically an energy-only project won't pay for any upgrades.
Okay, thanks.
And as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, you can do so by clicking on your raise hand icon on WebEx or pressing #2 on your phone if you are dialed in only. And at this time, I see no questions.
Perfect. Next slide, please. And it goes back to Steve.
Why don't we go to the next slide, please? Bob, is this you?
Right. Yeah, this is Bob Emmert again. And this topic was a topic that was proposed by Southern California Edison. And they were requesting that we make it expressed within the tariff that when ICs agree to share a gen tie line, PTO interconnection facilities, and any related IRNUs at a substation across clusters, that the shared IRNUs are not subject to GitApp section 14.2.2. And that section requires the PTO to become what I refer to as the backstop financer for the upgrades when the earlier queued project executes the GIA and then withdraws, and the later queued project that's sharing one of those pieces of equipment still needs that upgrade. And so we did some research on it, and based on our research, the number of non-conforming GIAs that Edison had filed with FERC due to the issue, and we concluded that the number was not sufficient to warrant the number or the tariff changes that SCE is seeking. So the ISO continues to believe that the PTOs are able to protect themselves in these circumstances by aligning their GIA execution, their third posting, and commencement of construction activities. And we feel that the tariff really contemplated this. And so that is the best way short of doing something, a tariff change to protect the PTOs in these circumstances. So this topic will be dropped from the Phase 2 initiative. Are there any questions on this?
This time, it looks like we have no questions in queue.
Okay, let's move to the next slide.
I believe we're back to Debbie.
Yep. So the question 6.2, I forget at this point who raised it, sorry, but was whether a developer issues a notice to proceed to the PTO, the customer was looking for the PTO ISO to start planning for all upgrades, including their deliverability upgrades, as soon as the notice to proceed was received by the PTO. And looking at the data that we have with a large quantity of projects currently in the queue, it's not practical to start all upgrades when a notice to proceed is received, because the upgrades need to be sequenced based on all of the work that is going on for the upgrades for all the various projects that are in the queue. And the PTO needs to factor in their workforce availability to work on each one of the upgrades. Obviously, you know, you've got both PG&E and Edison have large areas that consist of their service area. So it would be very difficult to have people running from Blythe in the desert, you know, all the way over to Ventura to work on different projects simultaneously. The same thing with PG&E. You know, having somebody working up in Humboldt, all of a sudden, you know, a notice to proceed is received, and they got to run down to Bakersfield. So everything needs to be sequenced in order to be the most efficient for the upgrades to be actually constructed, planned, engineered, and constructed. So the ISO would like to see the interconnection customers working, once they do provide the notice to proceed, contacting the PTOs directly and working on the timing of the network upgrades for their project to ensure that the timing is consistent with the interconnection customers' timeline for getting their project to achieve their COD. And with that, I see Rayanne's hand is raised. If you could open up Rayanne's line.
Hi, Debbie. Can you hear me?
Yep.
First of all, I wanted to thank the CAISO for initiating the quarterly transmission forum as a part of addressing, I think, this issue. I think that provides needed, equitable, transparent information on the transmission upgrades. You know, I think it's kind of difficult to ask all the interconnection customers to individually contact the PTOs on the timing of network upgrades, and so the publishing of that quarterly data is a big help to address that. What came up in that January meeting, the first time we had the forum, and I felt like what wasn't really addressed there was that it became clear that the processes that each PTO uses to sort of identify when to start things, to the extent that they're resource limited, is it first come, first serve, original in-service date, you know, prioritization based on volume of capacity, construction timelines. We don't, as interconnection customers, have any insight into that, and we got sort of brief answers in response to the comments, but not a lot of transparency. So I'm hoping that maybe in that forum, the CAISO can push a little harder on that item and sort of meet us in the middle on this topic.
Okay. Okay, I'll pass that. I don't know, Jeff had some other meetings going on this morning, so I'm not sure if he's still on the call, but I'll pass that off.
I appreciate that you can't like commit to that wholeheartedly, but I did just want to sort of vocalize it in this context.
Yeah, but I think it's a good discussion to have so that everybody knows what's.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Chris, can you open up the line for Alan Combs?
Hi, thanks, Deb. This is Alan Combs with New Consulting. So the part that I don't understand is, I think I'm familiar with what's in the quarterly updates the PTOs are providing, which is an improvement. But shouldn't there at least be an obligation of the PTO to identify what the upgrades are? It's not always clear, and you have a signed IA. It has deadlines for everything, including, a COD. And so it just seems like the PTO should at least have some obligation to communicate which are the upgrades that are required for FCDS, and then second, whether they've, what the current COD is and whether they've, initiated construction. And I should add that, every individual project doesn't have an insurmountable number of upgrades required to achieve FCDS. So I'm not sure I totally agree with the characterization that there's just some undue complexity on what's required for an individual project. You should be able to state these are the upgrades and this is the timeline. And, we understand there's not significant LDs in the agreement, but there ought to be at least transparency. And it seems to me this CAISO, it's CAISO's tariff, so they should obligate the PTOs that are participating to meet some sort of service standard there.
So, Alan, a couple of things. With respect to the upgrades for deliverability, yes, those are in the agreement. They're also in RIMS. So you can check RIMS at any time to find out what the status is of your all the transmission projects associated with your project. And with respect to the transmission forum, they did add additional fields in the workbook to be able to go ahead and address the status of the different upgrades. And I don't believe that there were any additional comments at the April transmission forum requesting additional information. So I guess I would point
I'm pretty
you back
sure it was
to,
already asked that every upgrade we identify what projects depend on it, and I think that was pushed back. So it seems like the way to bring it back in is through the I process, kind of squarely at this issue, to at least provide some sort of service standard. If it's in RIMS, happy to look, but I wasn't aware it was there, but I'll take a look.
yeah, it's in RIMS. Look underneath the deliverability and transmission tab. And we've now gone ahead and implemented, actually about a year ago, implemented uploading after we get the reassessment, and then once we get the studies done, we upload all of the transmission upgrades that are required for each one of the projects. And then as we get updates from the PTO as to what the status is of the transmission upgrade, that status is then included in RIMS. That was an enhancement we put in about a year ago, I believe.
Thank you.
You're welcome. If you could go ahead and lower your hand if I've already answered your question. And Chris, can we go to the line of Abhishek?
Debbie, this is Abhishek. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Thanks for including this topic in I2. We were very interested in this topic, so thankful that you guys included it. I kind of understand the logic on what's going on here, but I had a quick question. So I understand that PTOs need to sequence upgrade to meet CODs. That's a valid and fair point. I was just trying to make sure if the way each PTO sequence is there, what is the process that gets followed, right? So we know there is a lot of transmission planning process-driven upgrades, and then there is a lot of generation interconnection process-driven upgrades. Is there like a sequencing process that each PTOs follow, and are they consistent among different PTOs?
To tell you the truth, I have no idea. Would you mind bringing that up? I'll pass that on to Jeff also. But if you could bring that up in the transmission development forum, I think there's one coming up fairly soon for the Q3. They did Q2 in April.
It's Jeffrey W. It should be in late July is when the next Transmission Development Forum meeting will be.
Okay.
And briefly on those, and it's probably for the PTOs to answer, but there's a variety of different things that drive the priorities. Some of it is safety, and some of it is the sequencing for projects as well. So, but in regards to there being consistency, I think there is in regards to some, but like I say, it depends upon what are the situation and the area and other requirements that are within the PTO's kind of requirements for those as to, like I say, some of it is related to public safety, some of it's reliability, and then the projects themselves and coordinating all of those.
Does that give you some direction, Abhishek?
Yeah. I'm thinking, and my only concern is that, if, let's say, if my project for some reason is in a PTO where there is lots of transmission upgrades coming out of transmission planning process, would a generation interconnection process triggered upgrade, would it get delayed in that case? And, it directly impacts my ability to gain that full capacity deliverability status. So, I was just, thinking around those lines and not sure if it's, I'm going to put that in comments. Maybe, if ISO and PTOs can give that some more thought, that'll be quite helpful.
Okay, that sounds great.
This time I see no more questions in queue.
All right, next slide, please. And I'll pass this on to Steve or Ellie.
Ellie, I think.
Okay.
Thank you, Deb. Next slide, please. The next step in the proposed schedule is the comment deadline on June 28th. We also plan to publish the draft final proposal on July 26th, followed by a stakeholder call on August 2nd with comments due August 16th. We then plan to publish the final proposal and draft tariff language on September 13th, followed by a stakeholder call on September 20th with comments due on October 4th, and we are scheduled to go to the board in October. Next slide, please. As a reminder, please submit comments on the revised draft proposal and today's meeting discussion by June 28th using the commenting tool located on the initiative webpage, which is now available. For more information on the ICE 2021 Phase 2 initiative, please visit the initiative webpage. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com. Next slide, please. And before we close today's meeting, the ISO is pleased to announce this year's Stakeholder Symposium, which will be held in person at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento on November 9th and 10th. Registration for the event will be open later this month, and a public notice will be issued once the site is available. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at symposiumreg@CAISO.com. Thank you for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for a limited time after this meeting. We look forward to receiving your comments and have a great rest of your day. Operator, you may now conclude the call.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.